What happens when a prank goes too far and the line between fun and betrayal disappears? I thought it was harmless, a joke for the group, but it quickly became a trap I couldn't escape. By the time he returned, nothing was the same, and I had crossed a boundary I couldn't take back. I'm Sera Whitlock, 32, and I used to think a little thrill never hurt anyone. Damian, my husband, was steady, reliable, calm, the kind of man people said I was lucky to have. I loved him, or at least I told myself I did, but sometimes the safe, orderly life we shared felt suffocating. I craved excitement, control, and the rush of doing something unpredictable, even if it skirted the edges of morality. It started as a joke, a prank I thought harmless. We were on a road trip with friends, and I convinced everyone to leave Damian behind for a few hours, a fake car issue, just to see his reaction. My heart raced with excitement, imagining the surprise, the thrill, the little chaos we could create. I laughed and told myself it was playful, that he would understand, that it was only a temporary stunt. But the joke carried me further than I intended. As he waited stranded, I drove ahead, excitement and mischief clouding my judgment. I called Liam, my ex, arranging a meeting at a remote cabin I had rented for the night. I convinced myself it was just a harmless thrill, that Damian would never know, that I could enjoy a moment of freedom without consequence. By the time Damian returned, nothing was the same. The prank had crossed a line I hadn't foreseen. My careful justifications and playful rationalizations suddenly felt meaningless. The thrill had given way to fear, and the quiet realization that my actions might have consequences far beyond a simple joke settled over me like a weight I couldn't escape. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. The day started with an energy I could barely contain. Damian had suggested a road trip with friends to celebrate the weekend, and I had agreed, already thinking about how I could make it more exciting. The kids were with my parents, so there was no one to complicate the plans. Clara was in on the scheme, giggling as we discussed the details of a prank I had been planning for weeks. The idea was simple. We would fake a car issue and leave Damian stranded on the highway for a few hours, while the rest of us continued ahead. I told myself it was harmless, playful, just a way to add excitement to an otherwise predictable life. We loaded the car with snacks, music, and luggage for the weekend. Clara kept glancing at me, her eyes sparkling with mischief, and whispered, "Are you really going to do it?" I smiled, feeling the thrill in my chest. "Of course," I said, pretending confidence while my heart raced. "It'll be funny. He'll get over it. It's just a joke." My stomach flipped at the thought, a mixture of excitement and fear, but I pushed the worry aside. This was about control, about testing boundaries, about proving to myself that I could orchestrate a little chaos without consequence. As we approached the spot on the highway I had picked, I texted Damian about a mechanical issue, vague enough to seem plausible, urgent enough to make him pause. I watched his reaction in the rearview mirror, pretending to be concerned while secretly enjoying the panic I saw cross his face. Clara laughed softly beside me, urging me to stay focused. "It's going to be great," she whispered. I nodded, trying to calm my racing pulse. Damian pulled over and got out, looking at me through the windshield with a mixture of confusion and irritation. I waved, smiling, and shouted that we'd be back in a few hours. He frowned, but said nothing more, returning to check the engine. I could see the frustration building, and a small part of me felt guilty, but that was quickly replaced by anticipation, the thrill of knowing I had orchestrated a moment entirely on my terms. Once he was stranded, we continued driving, laughter filling the car as we sped toward our weekend destination. I felt untouchable, clever, in control, but the true excitement lay ahead. I had texted Liam earlier, arranging to meet at a remote cabin I had booked. The thought of seeing him again, of reliving a part of my past I had left unfinished, made my chest tighten with anticipation. I convinced myself it was harmless, a fleeting indulgence, a momentary thrill. Damian wouldn't know, wouldn't find out, and I would return as if nothing had happened. By mid-afternoon, we reached the cabin. Clara helped me unload the car, her eyes curious but trusting. I checked my phone nervously, a message from Liam blinking. "I'm here. Come in when you're ready." My hands shook slightly as I texted back that I would be there in a few minutes. Every step toward the cabin felt charged, like stepping into a world where rules and consequences didn't exist. I told myself this was harmless fun, that Damian would forgive the prank, that seeing Liam again would be a fleeting thrill with no lasting damage. Inside the cabin, the air was warm, the scent of pine and wood filling the space. Liam greeted me with a cautious smile, unsure of how serious my visit was. I laughed softly, brushing aside the tension, telling myself it was just a reunion, just a moment of nostalgia. But as we reminisced, the line between harmless fun and danger blurred. I felt a rush of excitement, a temptation that I had promised myself I would resist. Clara's warnings echoed faintly in my mind, but I dismissed them, convinced that I could handle the situation, that Damian would never discover, that this was my moment to reclaim freedom and thrill. Back on the highway, Damian was still waiting, unaware of what had happened beyond the car issue. I imagined his confusion, the worry, the frustration of being stranded. My stomach tightened as a pang of guilt surfaced, but I pushed it aside. I rationalized that it was all part of the prank, that he would understand, that the thrill of the weekend would overshadow any irritation. My heart raced as I returned to the cabin, aware that the excitement of secrecy made every action feel heightened, every glance loaded with anticipation. By nightfall, the prank had succeeded. Damian had been left stranded for hours, and I was standing at the threshold of temptation I had orchestrated myself. The thrill, the secrecy, the adrenaline coursing through me, it all felt intoxicating, empowering, and dangerous. I told myself I was clever, in control, untouchable, even as a tiny voice in the back of my mind whispered that the joke might have consequences I couldn't yet foresee. The night was just beginning, and I was on the edge of a line I had no intention of respecting. Damian's absence, the prank, the freedom to act without immediate consequence, all of it had created a moment that felt limitless, and I was ready to step into it fully, unaware of how far I had already gone and how irreversibly it would alter everything I had taken for granted. The next morning, the thrill from the previous day had not faded, though a small part of me felt the first pangs of guilt. The cabin was quiet, the sunlight filtering through the pine trees, and I found myself pacing the living room, pretending to plan the day while secretly anticipating Liam's arrival. Clara had suggested we spend some time hiking, but I had other plans. My mind kept drifting to the conversation I had arranged with Liam the night before, the possibility of reconnecting, of reliving something I had left unfinished. I rationalized it as harmless, a temporary indulgence before the weekend ended, before Damian returned. I told myself Damian wouldn't discover anything. The prank had been clever. He had been stranded, isolated, and entirely unaware of what I had orchestrated. My heart raced at the thought, and a thrill ran through me. The moral weight of my intentions was something I pushed aside, masked with excitement and the illusion of control. Clara's laughter echoed from the next room, a constant reminder that the day was mine to shape, mine to direct, mine to manipulate. By mid-morning, I received a text from Liam. "I'm outside. Ready when you are." My hands trembled as I typed back, trying to appear calm, nonchalant. "Give me a minute." I could feel the exhilaration and the guilt battling inside me. I told myself it was only a fleeting moment, that nothing would change, that it was harmless fun. But even as I said it to myself, a part of me knew I was already crossing a line I could not uncross. I stepped outside and saw Liam waiting, leaning casually against his car. His cautious smile betrayed a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. I laughed softly, brushing off the tension, insisting in my own mind that this was nothing serious. As we walked into the cabin, our conversation started with small talk, reminiscing about the past, old jokes, and shared memories. I told myself it was just nostalgia, that the encounter was innocent. But the air between us charged quickly, every glance, every laugh, every casual touch creating a tension I couldn't ignore. Inside the cabin, I could feel the thrill of secrecy. The walls held only us and the quiet of the forest outside. I told myself Damian would never know, that Clara's encouragement meant I could indulge a little without consequence. Liam spoke softly, reminiscing about old times, and I felt a pull, a temptation that made my pulse quicken. I rationalized every step, every glance, every word as harmless, a way to reclaim freedom, to feel alive, to indulge in a moment I had orchestrated entirely on my own terms. Hours passed with laughter, stories, and subtle touches that I told myself were innocent, playful, fleeting. But inside, a knot of anxiety had started to form. The excitement of secrecy collided with the weight of my own recklessness. I whispered to myself that nothing serious would happen, that Damian would never know, that I was merely enjoying a moment of autonomy. But the moral lines I had promised myself to respect blurred, and I felt the first flicker of fear that perhaps I had gone too far. Clara occasionally peeked into the cabin, offering encouragement or a joke, unaware of the tension building between Liam and me. She was the perfect accomplice, someone to provide reassurance that what I was doing was harmless, playful, and forgivable. I leaned on her presence, convincing myself that the moral responsibility for the situation was diffused, that the thrill justified the risk. By late afternoon, the temptation had grown stronger. Liam's presence, the quiet of the cabin, the thrill of secrecy, it all created a perfect storm of excitement. I found myself rationalizing actions I would never have imagined taking in front of Damian or anyone else. Every justification was a whispered mantra. It's harmless. He'll never know. It's only temporary. It's just for fun. My pulse raced as I convinced myself that I deserved a moment of exhilaration, that this was a reward for the monotony of everyday life. Then came the moment of choice. Liam looked at me, a mix of hope and hesitation in his eyes. I could feel the weight of what I was about to do, and yet I dismissed it with laughter and rationalization. It's fine. Just a moment. Nothing permanent. No one will ever know. The thrill of secrecy was intoxicating, and I stepped fully into the temptation, believing I was clever, untouchable, and in control. Back on the highway, Damian remained stranded, unaware that the prank had evolved into something far beyond a joke. The thought of his confusion, frustration, and worry lingered in my chest, a faint pang of guilt that I pushed aside. I convinced myself it was part of the prank, that it would all make sense later, that the thrill of freedom and excitement was worth the risk. By evening, the cabin was quiet, the shadows long across the walls, and the exhilaration of the day had taken full hold. I felt alive, untouchable, and utterly reckless. The thrill of secrecy, the adrenaline, and the temptation had blurred every line I had promised myself I would respect. I told myself it was temporary, that Damian would never find out, that nothing permanent had been done. But deep down, a whisper of fear remained, hinting that the prank had already begun to create consequences I could not predict or control. The night settled over the cabin with a quiet intensity that made every sound feel magnified. The forest outside was dark, the wind rustling through the trees, and inside, the tension between Liam and me was almost tangible. I told myself repeatedly that it was harmless, just a playful indulgence, a temporary thrill that would end before Damian returned. But with every glance, every laugh, every casual touch, The line between harmless fun and reckless betrayal blurred further. My heart raced, my pulse quickened, and a part of me, deep down, knew I was crossing a boundary I could never reclaim. Clara had retired to the guest room earlier, leaving us alone in the cabin. I told myself this was just a moment, a fleeting indulgence, nothing more. But the quiet intimacy of the cabin, the thrill of secrecy, the knowledge that Damian was stranded miles away, all of it combined into a heady mix of excitement and fear. I rationalized my actions as a reward, a brief escape from the monotony of everyday life, convincing myself that Damian would never know, that no one would ever discover. Liam spoke softly, leaning closer, and I laughed nervously, trying to keep the moment light. "It's just for fun," I whispered to myself, a mantra repeated over and over. Every shared memory, every reminisced story drew us closer, and I found myself excusing the tension, framing it as nostalgia rather than temptation. I convinced myself that Damian's absence justified this moment, that orchestrating a little thrill was harmless, and that I could return to normal life without consequence. Hours passed. We shared laughter, jokes, and quiet stories from the past. But the energy in the cabin was different now, heavier, charged. I tried to convince myself that it was still playful, still innocent, but a knot of anxiety had begun to form in my stomach. Every glance Liam cast, every soft word he spoke, heightened my awareness that I was moving beyond the boundaries I had promised myself I would respect. I whispered excuses under my breath. "It's fine. It's harmless. No one will know." Clara occasionally appeared in the doorway, unaware of the depth of the tension, offering encouragement and light-hearted jokes. I leaned on her presence, finding reassurance in her laughter, convincing myself that the moral responsibility was diffused, that I was merely enjoying a harmless indulgence with a friend. Every rationalization seemed to strengthen my resolve, every whispered mantra seemed to make the situation acceptable. By late evening, the temptation became almost unbearable. Liam's presence, the thrill of secrecy, the quiet intensity of the cabin, all of it combined into a heady, intoxicating force. I felt a mixture of exhilaration and fear, and yet I pushed the fear aside, convincing myself it was only temporary, that nothing would have lasting consequences. Every thought was a justification. It's just one night. It's harmless. Damian will never know. It's my right to enjoy this. We moved closer, the distance between us disappearing almost without conscious thought. I laughed nervously, masking the tension with playful chatter, telling myself that it was all under control. Liam's eyes met mine, filled with curiosity and caution, and I felt the final pull, the undeniable temptation that had been building all day. My mind raced, calculating consequences, weighing risks, but the thrill of secrecy was stronger. I whispered reassurances to myself. This is fine. It's only temporary. Nothing permanent. As the night deepened, the boundaries I had promised myself to respect disappeared entirely. Every rationalization, every justification, every whispered mantra failed to quiet the growing realization that what I was about to do would have consequences far beyond a single night. Yet the thrill was intoxicating, the adrenaline rushing through me, and I stepped fully into the moment, convinced that I was clever, untouchable, and in control. Meanwhile, back on the highway, Damian remained stranded, oblivious to the evolution of my prank into something far more consequential. I imagined his confusion, frustration, and worry, and a flicker of guilt passed through me, quickly suppressed by the rush of excitement. I told myself it was still harmless, that it was a brief, contained indulgence that would be forgotten by morning. By the early hours, the cabin was silent except for the soft murmur of the wind outside. The thrill of secrecy, the temptation, and the adrenaline had taken full control. I told myself repeatedly that it was temporary, that Damian would never find out, that nothing permanent had been done. Yet even as I convinced myself of these lies, a small voice inside whispered warnings, hinting at consequences I could not yet see, consequences that would soon begin to unfold, quietly, inevitably, and without any way to stop them. As I lay in the quiet cabin, adrenaline slowly fading into the deep hum of fatigue, I realized that the night I had orchestrated for fun had already started dictating events I could not control. The thrill, once intoxicating, was now heavy with anticipation and fear. I had crossed a line, and though I tried to rationalize it, the first seeds of doubt and unease had taken root, warning me that the consequences of this reckless night were only beginning to show. The next morning, the weight of what had happened in the cabin hit me in full force. The sunlight streaming through the pine trees felt almost accusatory, highlighting the mess I had created for myself. I tried to convince myself it was just a moment, a temporary thrill, a harmless indulgence before Damian returned. But even as I rationalized, a gnawing sense of dread began to creep in. The prank, the secrecy, the betrayal, they were no longer just moments of fun. They were threads weaving a web I could not escape. Clara was still sleeping, oblivious to the full implications of the night before. I paced the cabin, pretending to plan the day, but my mind kept circling back to Liam, to the choices I had made, to the whispered excuses I had offered myself. Every rationalization felt weaker under the light of day. I told myself Damian would never find out, that the prank had provided the perfect cover, that this thrill would remain mine and mine alone. But somewhere deep inside, I knew the truth was more complicated. I kept imagining Damian stranded on the highway, alone, confused, frustrated, and I felt a pang of guilt that I quickly tried to suppress. I had orchestrated the prank to feel clever, to push boundaries, to see what I could get away with. Now, with the thrill replaced by the quiet of the cabin and the knowledge of my own recklessness, the weight of responsibility pressed down. The excitement of secrecy that had propelled me through the night now twisted into anxiety. By mid-morning, Liam suggested we go for a walk outside, into the woods around the cabin. I agreed, smiling, but my hands trembled slightly. The fresh air and the forest didn't calm me. They only reminded me how isolated I had made myself, how far I had moved from the life I had promised to honor with Damian. We walked in silence at first, then exchanged small talk, laughing lightly, trying to recapture the innocence I had convinced myself existed. But every word, every glance was loaded. The thrill of secrecy was still there, but it carried a new weight, a reminder that what I was doing was no longer playful. It was reckless. Returning to the cabin, I tried to distract myself with chores and small tasks. Clara emerged from her room, cheerful and oblivious to the tension I was carrying. She suggested we cook lunch together, keeping the mood light, and I nodded, forcing laughter, masking my unease. I realized how carefully I had to navigate every interaction, how much I had to manipulate my own behavior to maintain the illusion that nothing had shifted, that the prank remained harmless. By afternoon, I started to notice the first cracks in my rationalizations. The thrill I had felt the night before was fading, replaced by a creeping awareness of the consequences. I kept whispering to myself, trying to maintain control. It's harmless. No one will know. Nothing permanent happened. But even as I repeated the phrases, a part of me felt the truth. The line I had crossed, the betrayal I had allowed, was not something I could easily undo. I found myself replaying the prank over and over in my head, imagining Damian's confusion and frustration, imagining the worry he must have felt while stranded. The realization that he could soon return, that he might sense the shift in my behavior, made my stomach twist. I tried to focus on the present, on the mundane tasks around the cabin, but every sound, every shadow, every creak of the wooden floor seemed to remind me that the moment of recklessness had consequences. By late afternoon, Liam began to hint that we might be pushing boundaries too far. He looked at me with caution. a subtle warning in his expression. I laughed it off, insisting that everything was fine, that it was still harmless fun, still a temporary indulgence. But inside, a tiny voice whispered doubt. The exhilaration of secrecy was beginning to be replaced by the weight of potential discovery. My mind raced, calculating risks, imagining every scenario in which Damian could learn the truth. As evening approached, I grew anxious about the timing. The prank, the betrayal, the secrecy, they had been orchestrated to avoid detection, but I now realized how fragile that cover was. The line between thrill and recklessness had already blurred, and the first flickers of fear that I had dismissed the night before had returned with full force. I told myself repeatedly that Damian would forgive, that nothing permanent had been done, that I could return as if nothing had changed. But the cabin felt smaller, more oppressive, every shadow a reminder of the truth I was avoiding. By nightfall, the excitement that had carried me through the day had completely transformed. I was left alone with my thoughts, the echo of the prank, the tension of secrecy, and the creeping realization that my actions could have irreversible consequences. The thrill of rebellion and indulgence had faded, replaced by anxiety, guilt, and the sobering understanding that the night I had orchestrated for fun had already begun to shape events I could not control. The line I had promised myself I would not cross had been crossed, and I could feel the inevitable reckoning approaching, silent, precise, and inescapable. The following morning, I woke with a mixture of exhilaration and dread. The thrill of the previous night had faded, leaving behind a gnawing awareness of the line I had crossed. The cabin was quiet, the sunlight filtering through the pine trees, and I realized I couldn't ignore the consequences any longer. Damian would soon return, and the prank, the betrayal, the secrecy, they were no longer harmless moments. I tried to tell myself it was temporary, that nothing permanent had happened, but a sense of impending reckoning pressed heavily on my chest. Clara was still asleep in the guest room, oblivious to the weight of what had happened. I moved through the cabin, attempting to tidy up, to occupy myself with trivial tasks, but my mind kept returning to Liam, to the choices I had made, to the whispered rationalizations that had guided me into this situation. Every excuse I had used to justify my actions, it's harmless, it's temporary, he'll never know, felt weaker under the clarity of daylight. The prank that had seemed clever the day before now loomed as a dangerous miscalculation, and I could feel the consequences tightening like a grip I could not escape. By mid-morning, Liam suggested another walk outside, into the forest surrounding the cabin. I agreed, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to maintain calm. The fresh air did little to soothe my nerves. Instead, it reminded me how isolated I had become, how far I had strayed from the life I had promised to honor with Damian. We walked in silence at first, then began reminiscing about old times, joking and laughing, but even these moments carried tension. Every word and glance felt loaded, charged with the knowledge of what had happened and what could happen when Damian returned. When we returned to the cabin, Clara emerged from her room, cheerful and oblivious. She suggested we prepare lunch together, and I forced myself to participate, masking my inner anxiety with laughter and casual conversation. Every movement, every word required careful calculation. I was aware that one misstep, one careless expression, could unravel the careful illusion I had created, that Damian would never discover the truth. By mid-afternoon, I realized that the thrill of secrecy had begun to sour. The exhilaration of the night before was replaced by anxiety and doubt. I whispered to myself, trying to maintain control, "It's harmless. Nothing permanent happened. Damian will never know." Yet even as I repeated these phrases, a sense of foreboding grew. The prank, the betrayal, the secrecy, it was no longer under my control. I had pushed the boundaries too far, and the first signs of consequence were already forming, silent and inevitable. Liam began to speak cautiously, hinting that we might be pushing limits too far. I laughed off his warnings, insisting everything was fine, that it was still just a harmless indulgence, a fleeting moment of excitement. But deep inside, a flicker of fear burned. I realized that the carefully orchestrated secrecy I had relied on could crumble at any moment, that the next step, the return of Damian, could bring everything crashing down. By late afternoon, I felt the first real pangs of guilt. I thought about Damian, stranded the day before, confused and frustrated, and I felt a wave of shame. My rationalizations, it's just a prank, it's temporary, it's harmless, were collapsing under the weight of reality. The thrill I had sought so desperately had led me to recklessness, and I could sense that the consequences were gathering, waiting for him to return. Evening approached, and the cabin grew quiet again. The adrenaline that had carried me through the day waned, leaving space for reflection and dread. I tried to distract myself, organizing small tasks, tidying the living room, arranging the kitchen, but the tension remained, heavy and unyielding. I realized that my choices, the prank, the deception, the indulgence with Liam, had set a chain of events in motion that I could no longer influence or control. By nightfall, I was alone with my thoughts, acutely aware of the precariousness of my situation. The thrill of rebellion and secrecy had vanished, replaced by anxiety, guilt, and the anticipation of inevitable confrontation. The prank that had seemed clever, harmless, playful, was now a source of dread. I understood that I had crossed a boundary, that I had acted recklessly, and that the consequences were already approaching, silent, precise, and irreversible. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm my mind. Every rationalization, every excuse I had used to justify my behavior felt hollow. The thrill had been intoxicating, but it had come at a cost I could no longer ignore. Damian's return was imminent, and I knew that nothing I could say or do would prevent the consequences that were about to unfold. The prank had escalated into betrayal, the secrecy into exposure, and the reckoning was already at the door, waiting to claim everything I had taken for granted. By the time Damian returned, the weight of the previous days had settled over me like a storm I could not escape. The prank, the secrecy, the betrayal, it all hung between us, unspoken but undeniable. He didn't storm in yelling or accuse. He simply entered the apartment with calm precision, his eyes scanning the space, noting the subtle changes, the evidence I had left behind. My chest tightened, my pulse raced, and for the first time, I realized that charm, humor, and rationalization would not protect me. The children ran to him eagerly, oblivious to the tension, and he knelt to greet them, patient and composed. Watching him, I felt the first real pang of guilt. The prank that had seemed harmless had altered everything. His calm authority contrasted sharply with my recklessness. He had been methodical all along, and now the consequences were about to take shape in a way I could not manipulate. He motioned for me to sit at the kitchen table, placing a thick folder in front of me. I forced a smile, tried to act casual, attempted a joke to lighten the moment, but he didn't respond. He simply looked at me, silent, deliberate, and the weight of that quiet pressed down more heavily than any confrontation could have. Inside the folder were printed messages, texts, and notes documenting the prank, my interactions with Liam, and the rationalizations I had whispered to myself. Every action I had taken, every word I had spoken, was catalogued in clear, undeniable detail. Then came the legal documents, custody arrangements, asset protections, and measures to ensure both parties' stability had already been prepared. Damian explained calmly that these were necessary, that they weren't punishment, but consequence, lawful, precise, and unavoidable. I tried to deny, to spin the narrative, to insist it had been harmless fun, but the evidence was overwhelming. My attempts to manipulate or excuse my behavior were meaningless against the meticulous preparation he had undertaken. As he left the room to make calls and finalize arrangements, I sat alone, staring at the folders. The apartment felt impossibly small, every object a reminder of the choices I had made. I realized the prank, the indulgence with Liam, and my reckless secrecy had triggered consequences I could no longer control. Damian had acted without spectacle, without anger, and yet completely dismantled my control. By nightfall, movers arrived to enforce the separation of property and belongings. I watched silently, powerless, as everything I had assumed I could manipulate was methodically divided and removed. My phone buzzed with messages from friends and family, but I ignored them. There was nothing anyone could do to alter what had been set in motion. On the kitchen counter, a single note remained, written in Damian's calm, precise handwriting. You wanted a thrill. I ensured the consequences permanent. The words cut deeper than any argument ever could. I was left alone with the full weight of my choices, the reckless thrill I had chased, and the irreversible consequences that had already taken hold. The life I had believed I controlled was gone, and there was nothing left I could do to reclaim it. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching,